I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're having our first drive in the new second generation Nissan Leaf. Now, the second gen Leaf isn't completely new. It's been out in the US, Europe, Japan for about a year now, but it's only just reached Australian shores, so that means that we get to have a detailed go at this thing. Now, Nissan were very early to the mainstream electric vehicle thing way back at the start of this decade. So the second generation Leaf is all about following up that initial car, making it more refined, easier to live with, better range, more torque, all of which this vehicle right here promises to do. It's also got to be comfortable and flexible inside, and that's what we're going to check out first before we take this thing out onto the road. But before we do that, a few specifics on the Leaf. So effectively, this is 50 grand all in, drive away plus a home wall charger for slightly faster charging is about 56,000 Australian dollars. We've got a 40 kilowatt hour battery in this thing, produces 110 kilowatts of power and 320 Newton meters of torque. So that puts it right in the middle of the sort of Hyundai Ioniq electric, Kona Electric territory here in Australia. This car splits the difference in range and price, so it means it's quite an interesting option if you've got about 56,000 to spend. But uniquely, the Leaf also has built-in from the factory ability to do the two-way charging. So your house can charge the car, your car can charge the house if electricity regulations and the technology is there and developed in Australia to support that. That's still basically in progress here, but it could be very cool in future. But first, let's check out the interior. Here inside the Leaf, it's a bit of a mix of new and old, if I'm honest. This car does introduce many new aspects of Nissan interior design language to the Australian market, which is good. We get a preview of some tech that we'll start to see rolling out across other Nissans in future. But there are also parts of the Leaf's cabin that aren't as high tech and feel a little bit older than some other cars in this market, notably the Hyundai Ioniq and Kona Electric siblings that I mentioned before. But first, onto what's new. So we've got a significantly upgraded infotainment system by Nissan standards. 8 inches in size. It's much better and bigger than that pokey system in the X-Trail and cars like that. It's got new software, it's quite a bit faster, and importantly, it has Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, so you can just forget about the integrated system and use software made by the experts. We've also got a partially digital gauge cluster up here, which can give you a digital speedo, it can show you your range, readout, and a bunch of interesting diagnostic information about the car. You do have an analog speedo as well beside that, which is cool. And there are, a few futuristic elements. This interesting shifter for the sort of planetary gear set that channels the power in this car. Now, you've also got stuff like fully heated seats throughout the car, front and rear, and a heated steering wheel. Not actually for luxurious reasons, but because it's a more efficient way to heat bodies in the car than just by blowing hot air at them through the vents. I think that's actually really cool, and I do get it. There are other parts of the interior that feel maybe a little old-fashioned though. There's a fair bit of hard plastic about the place. It sort of looks, it's okay. It's not that futuristic, it's not that upmarket. It just gets the job done, in my opinion. The other thing is that although the seats are quite comfortable and shapely and trimmed in partial sort of Alcantara-ish material, partial leather, with cool blue stitching, the driving position is pretty high, and that's because the batteries are beneath us. And we're going to start seeing this on a lot of electric cars, is that you sit higher than you expect. It's not a criticism of the Leaf, it's just a fact of how these vehicles work. The other element of the car that just appears maybe a little dated is the fact that there's only one USB port for this whole thing. And when you think about it, this is like the world's biggest iPhone charger. It probably needed a little bit more than that, to be honest. And you also don't get wireless smartphone charging, but you do get a sort of phone tray or potentially a Nissan Leaf biscuit tray, decent sized cup holders and decent sized door bins too. That same feeling of sitting high extends to the back. Honestly, the seating position is more like that of a small SUV than a hatchback because of those low set batteries. You can see that for me, like my head is kind of next to the sill here, but you do have a good view down from the window, which is interesting. But the other thing to reflect on is that the amount of space back here is pretty generous. So I'm 6 foot, I've got another inch of headroom, leg room's okay, toe room, a little bit constrained, but 4 adults will fit in this car. However, you can tell that the Leaf is really set up for couples, occasional use of the back seat, because apart from the heated bench, which is heated as one stage, you can't heat both seats individually, it's a little oppressive back here, kind of scratchy plastics, just a little bit of padding on the armrest and no air vents or USB ports. But as transport for four, it does get the job done nicely. Here around the back of the Leaf, it's clearly a family affair. The look is pretty reminiscent of the first gen car, so if you're upgrading from that, you'll feel right at home. Now, behind this tailgate, there's a decent amount of boot space. It opens nice and high. The opening is wide enough, but there is a big load lip, so you've got to lift heavy stuff kind of over and out of the boot, which is slightly annoying. And there's also stuff that takes up a fair bit of room. So charging paraphernalia, the AC cable, part of the Bose stereo system does eat up a bit of space. So in terms of outright carrying capacity, it's not huge, but it's a day-to-day, hatchback. So for all of that sort of stuff, it's just fine. So what's the new Leaf like to drive? Well, first and foremost, it's definitely more convincing behind the wheel than the first gen car. You'd expect that because the original is coming up on a decade old now, so there's plenty more learnings from Nissan's vehicle development that have gone into this one. But that said, we've had our gripes with the way Nissans have driven in the last few years. So does the Leaf fall into the good to drive category like the Qashqai and I guess like the GTR, or in the slightly not so good category like the X-Trail? Well, thankfully it's the former. That starts with the powertrain, 40 kilowatt hour electric motor and battery, and that feels about right size for this car. So range under the WLTP criteria is 270 kilometers. So the average Australian who drives does about 30 Ks a day. So that's definitely enough to get a week's worth of driving done. And then you can charge it up in about 7 hours with a wall box at home that'll cost you another $2,000. Now, outputs are, generous-ish. 110 kilowatts of power, 320 newton meters of torque is the headline number. That's quite a lot more than, say, 250 newton meters in a relatively premium hatchback in this segment. And of course, being an electric vehicle, the torque is generated instantly, so it jumps forward like a go-kart, and these vehicles are fun to drive because of that. And that's not unique to the Leaf, it's common to any EV, but this one gets the job done too. And although it's not super fast, it feels about right for this vehicle. It's not slow, it's not overpowered, but that said, from a standing start, if you boot it, it can actually spin the front wheels. Now, the way that momentum gets to the road can be through Nissan's e-pedal setup. Now, you don't have to run it like that. You can have a conventional throttle that when you lift, it just coasts like a normal car, but e-power is actually a more fun way to drive the car. If you've driven a vehicle with strong regen braking, or a Tesla or something on its most sensitive kind of braking setting, then you'll know what this feels like. Essentially, you can drive the car almost entirely through the throttle, so you use varying degrees of throttle application to speed up or maintain momentum or slow down a little bit, and then coming up to a red light like this, all you have to do is lift the pedal and the regen is very strong and the car can come to a stop. Now, it does take a little while to judge it. I stopped too soon there, but I reckon it's something you get used to very quickly. There is a conventional brake pedal as well, and the transition from the sort of e-pedal braking regen to the standard brakes is a little bit odd. I think you'd have to adjust your driving style to be able to do that quickly and smoothly. Now, the ride of the car is a little firmer than we've come to expect from Nissan, but not in a non-compliant way. Over sort of big hits, the cabin is jarred, and the suspension itself is quite noisy. Or maybe it isn't, it's just that there's no engine noise, so you can hear all of the components of the car more clearly than in a combustion vehicle. So you can hear the front and rear suspension copying bumps much more than in a vehicle where the engine is always making noise. That said, over most bumps, the suspension soaks up imperfections in the road pretty well, and it sort of has this, I guess, slightly sporty, definitely not floaty feeling suspension, which is a relief. And body control is good, much better than some other Nissans, like especially the X-Trail. Now, similarly, the handling and the steering is more set up for comfort than athleticism, but that's no big deal in a car like this, which will largely be confined to in-town use. Steering isn't that quick, but it is nice and direct, and it does feel well connected to the front wheels. You can kind of trace a path nice and easily in the Leaf. It's also got a really tight turning circle, it's highly maneuverable, there's heaps of glass, the windows are very big because the roof's quite tall, so you can actually see out of this thing well. You can also see out of it well because there's a standard 360-degree camera. In fact, the standard spec is pretty high. you know, it's an expensive car for a hatchback, so it does need lots of equipment, and the good news is it has lots of safety tech. As for where the second gen Leaf fits in sort of the spectrum of electric cars available in Australia, I think it's really interesting because we haven't seen many full EVs around this price point, mainly just the Hyundai twins. You know, it definitely feels a little better screwed together than those cars. The quality is there, I think, in the Leaf. There's no rattles, no shakes. It does feel very well built. However, the cabin isn't as upmarket looking, nor as modern looking, and I think if you're looking for something a little more cutting edge without having to go to a Tesla, that Kona Electric is quite a nice option. It's also more powerful, so it really depends on what your priorities are. So the Nissan Leaf. A lot about this second gen car shows that Nissan have been doing this for a little bit longer than other major auto manufacturers, and as such there are lots of bits of this car that they get right. It's pretty good to drive. The suspension has that slightly, you know, better firmness and better body control than some of the slightly more lurchy EVs. It's good transport for 2, it's okay for 4. So for that reason, it does need to be on your consideration list if you're looking to move to as close to zero emission motoring as you can realistically get in Australia. Now, if you haven't subscribed to Chasing Cars, please do so below the video. Hit that notification bell so you never miss one of our full-length, highly detailed uploads. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.